Good day to you. I've got two questions for you. First of all, what's the greatest country in the world? It's the US, right? Second question, who's the greatest member of your family? Is it your brother? Is it your father? Is it your mother? Is it your sister? Dumb question, right? Yeah, that's just like the question that I asked to start this instructor video out, in my opinion. There is no greatest country in the world. There is no greatest member of the family. Everybody is great in different ways, but there's no greatest. And it's a mark of a person who hasn't really traveled to ask that question and to answer it, who's the greatest country in the world, with the US. Of course, the US is a great nation, but there is no absolute greatest term, in my opinion. And that, in essence, is introducing our subject for today because we're talking about the U.S. We're talking about the U.S. specifically as a culture. We're going to talk about the dominant cultures within the U.S., and we're also going to talk about how the U.S. is a dominating country culture across the world. So let's talk about it. But, when we're talking about it, the reason that we have this discussion, we're having this discussion, and the reason that there's a chapter on it is because when you're immersed in your own culture, your own country, it's difficult to study. Especially if you haven't had the chance to travel, it's difficult to gain a comparative basis on what makes your country different, what is the dominant culture, and how the values of that culture affect the way that you think. So that's what we're trying to get at today. And just some basic facts about the U.S., which you may not even know despite living here, is the U.S. is the third largest country in the world. It's not the largest, it's not the second largest, it's the third. First is Russia. Russia has 11 time zones. We have 4. Russia has 11. So that shows how wide Russia is. Second up is Canada. Of course, most of it is ice, but it is the second largest country. And the third largest is the U.S. country. But also, it is the biggest economy in the world, the U.S., or it has the biggest economy. We've jockeyed back and forth with China recently, but we're back on top as the largest economy in the world. And also, a point that's not made by the chapter is the U.S. dominates the media that circulate around the world. Our TV shows, our musical artists, our newspapers to some extent, our internet sites, they're what is dominating going around the world more than any other media, more than media from any other country. So now let's turn to discussing what makes up the modern day American culture. And the first thing we're going to talk about is the origins of U.S. cultural patterns. And it does begin before we became a country, really. We're talking about in the 16th century, late 1500s, early 1600s. And at that time, North America, not just the U.S., but Canada, U.S., and parts of Mexico, considered part of North America, North America had about 10 million indigenous peoples, people who were here before settlers came, and they were speaking hundreds of languages. We refer to them today sometimes as Indians, but we all know the story about how they got that name from Columbus. So really, indigenous peoples is a better term. And of all the tribes or nations, as they were known, probably the most dominant one, and therefore maybe the most important one in contributing to our culture, was the Iroquois. The Iroquois Indians were based here around the Adirondack Mountains up through Niagara Falls, but they came to dominate the greater Northeast. Sadly, we don't have too many remains of the Iroquois Indians. They were wiped out by disease that were brought by the settlers, and also, as we know, the settlers subjugated them and placed them on Indian reservations. But at the time, they had their own system of government. In fact, they are cited as an influential source on the U.S. Constitution because the Iroquois had a constitution that had a checks and balances system, and our system ended up with that same idea between Congress, the executive branch, which is the president, and the judiciary. Nevertheless, in the 1600s, the Iroquois basically controlled the Northeast. They were named by other tribes. They were called the Iroquois. They didn't call themselves the Iroquois. They were named by other tribes as rattlesnakes. But they called themselves as the people of the Longhouse. Nevertheless, Iroquois is a term that is derived from rattlesnakes. Okay, so we have all these nations of indigenous peoples here, and then we get the European Enlightenment as the next concept that we want to talk about. And that's happening in Europe. European Enlightenment is some society-wise values that started to emerge for many reasons, but mainly because of a break from religion as the only source of knowledge. And the reason that that was made possible was through the Gutenberg printing press, not discussed in the chapter, but the Gutenberg printing press allowed newspapers and books to be produced for the masses. And so what you have then is people starting to educate themselves and not having to rely on priests and other Catholic clergy, for the most part, to understand God. And so people started to educate themselves, and then you start to have them believing that there are other paths to knowledge other than through religion, and that's when you get the Enlightenment. They started to believe in scientific method. That's part of the European Enlightenment. The idea that you can study things and you can perform experiments to gain an understanding of life. Also, you have the emergence of democracy, again, because of the Gutenberg printing press, of placing the selection of politicians and government in the hands of everybody, because everybody can be educated. And that's what democracy is all about. It's about everybody is represented in their votes for candidates. And then finally, capitalism. Capitalism emerging from the European Enlightenment is a way of funding a society, that you can buy and sell goods and let the marketplace dictate how much those goods are going to cost. Try buying a soda in an airport, and you're going to pay a lot more than you will buying a soda at a country store, because in the airport there's no choices. The country store has to compete with lots of places and restaurants, other stores, and convenience stores. So that's capitalism. So that was brought over by European settlers who started to come to the U.S. The ones that we talk about the most in our founding are probably the Puritans. They came out of England. If you go up into New England, you can see where the Mayflower came across, the ship that brought the Puritans here. It was a very strict kind of religion. If you've ever read the Scarlet Letter, you'll know that it was a shame that was enacted upon a woman who had an affair with the preacher. And so we can say that the Puritan ethic is still at play today in terms of what we perceive to be appropriate sexual behavior on the part of people. The Puritans, nevertheless, they settled in Massachusetts in the 1600s. They were followed by lots of other people who came to the U.S. later on, but the Puritans were the founders. They were followed by people who were called royalists. They were people who were members of the royal family in England, associated in some way. They were knights or nobility, and they came to the Chesapeake Valley. That's why you have in Richmond, that's why you have in Virginia, a sort of a stately feeling there with these grandiose plantations, and it's has a sort of a royal feeling down there in Virginia. They settled down there. We had the Quakers. The Quakers came from England. They settled right here in Pennsylvania, the Mid-Atlantic as it's called. Down in Philadelphia they settled. They even had a long history here in the Poconos. A lot of the early resorts were built for Quakers. And if you think of the resorts in the Poconos, if you have been around, you will recognize that they are not ostentatious. They're not like Las Vegas resorts. That's because the Quakers were not really allowed to display their wealth. They were supposed to conduct their leisure in sort of a subdued fashion. Anyway, you have the Quakers, and they came to the Delaware Valley and Philadelphia and around there. And so then you started to have these people spreading out west through the railroad and through the Conestoga wagons. And eventually the U.S. starts to get spread out with peoples, and you have pockets of different cultures and people from different areas, like here in the Northeast, we have a lot of Italians that came in. Of course, we have African Americans brought here not by means of their own control through slavery, but the African Americans play a strong role in American culture. Some people say a disproportionate role, and that's a compliment. A lot of our culture is attributable to African American heritage. Look at rhythm and blues or hip hop, for example. When you consider African Americans being 10% of the population, but it's the most popular form of music among young people, that's quite an accomplishment. Anyway, there were some researchers, Anderson, Lustig, and Anderson, husband and wife team there, and they came up with some characterizations of people's behaviors in the U.S. based on where they came from. So New Englanders are said to be introverts. They keep to themselves. And Mid-Atlantic people in Pennsylvania, Delaware, and parts of New Jersey, those people are not very talkative. You can judge for yourself, but they kind of keep to themselves. Certainly, I think that's true of a lot of Pennsylvanians. People down from Texas and Oklahoma and Louisiana, I've lived in Texas, so I know this firsthand. They saw the importance of neighbors as being of greater importance than on the East Coast. And probably that's because when you're living in Texas, where the desert is you really rely on a neighbor. If you need help with something, even if your neighbor's 4 miles away, you're relying on that neighbor to help you out. And then there are people from the Pacific Coast, and they have the most isolation from their friends. They have the lowest interaction with confidence, people that they trust. Again, the spaces are so spread out when you get to Nevada, and Utah, and California before it got settled. You can see that. So there are some early characterizations of the America that started to emerge as the United States, a melting pot that we refer to it as today, and you can still look at it as a melting pot that the ingredients haven't completely melted. Like if you put lumps of cheese and milk, and you're trying to make an Alfredo sauce, it takes a while for those cheese lumps to just become complete liquid, and that's kind of where we're at. We have things still blending in the United States. Now let's move on to talking about forces that move towards developing a dominant culture. That is, what can we say makes us Americans? What are the dominant things that we do here in America? And so there was a Frenchman named Tocqueville, is how you pronounce his name, and he came and he went all around the U.S. and he kept a diary, and then he started to write about the U.S., what makes it different, and he predicted that the U.S. would become a great power. He did this back in the 1800s, so it was before the U.S. was a great power. He predicted it would become a great power because of its geographic size, third largest country in the world, that it has abundant natural resources. It's got 2 oceans, it's got lots of rivers, it's got forests, it's got minerals, it's got gasoline, oil, it's got natural gas, and lots of other things. And because the population is growing, and also because the character is very national. We like to think of ourselves as Americans. Next up is the idea that the Erie Canal, we forget that canals played a big role in the development of America, especially here in Pennsylvania. There are canals down in Easton, but the Erie Canal opened up New York City from Chicago, and the Great Lakes opened up New York City to become the financial and the corporate capital of, you can say the world, but certainly of the United States, because barges going up and down the canal could bring goods to New York City. So New York grows as this mega center and also serves as the point of entry to the U.S. for immigrants. Take a trip to Ellis Island sometime. It's really interesting. You'll see how immigrants arrived to the U.S., under what condition, and how they were processed before they started to spread out to other areas of the country. Other factors that go into developing our national culture include the defeat of the South and the Civil War. And then also there are 3 amendments that help to establish national citizenship, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to our Constitution. They establish national citizenship and the importance of being a citizen of America rather than a resident of Pennsylvania or New Jersey or New York, etc. Also, the development of radio and television nationalized our culture. We do that every time we watch Monday Night Football. We do that every time we watch Dancing with the Stars. We do that every time we hear a Taylor Swift song on the radio. We're joining in with people in Arizona and Montana and Illinois to also celebrate what makes us a national culture. Also, the automobile is to be credited with creating a dominant culture for us. The automobile, more than any other mode of transport. If you don't have a car, you're kind of screwed in the U.S. Some people can do it, but most people feel like they've got to have a car. And once they get one, then they're spending their money paying it, paying insurance, paying gas, paying repairs. It sort of takes over our lives, the automobile. But it did give us mobility. It gave us the ability to move around the country. And I myself, when I took my first job in California, I drove out to that job all the way from Pennsylvania. And then when I took my job back here in Pennsylvania, East Stroudsburg University, I drove back to Pennsylvania. The automobile has allowed our country to be very mobile and move around. Also, we have the Great Depression. The Great Depression and World War II and the Cold War, those 3 things together increased the power and the reach of our national government, because the national government had to step in and go to war in Europe for World War II, and had to step in and try and fix the economy during the Great Depression in the 1930s, and the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. The government was the one that was trying to protect us and keep us safe. So it increased the centralized government here in the U.S., down there in Washington, D.C. So all of these things together have created an incredible uniformity. An incredible uniformity. If you go to England and you say, what does a typical American look like? If they've never been to the United States, they will describe, well, I picture the typical American is driving around in a pickup truck and wearing a cowboy hat and listening to country music. Now, that, of course, doesn't describe most people. But it does well, maybe it does describe most people, but it doesn't describe all people. Nevertheless, that does get at a certain uniformity that we have here in the U.S. So now let's go on to a concept that's called value orientation theory. Value orientation theory is proposed by some researchers named Kluckhohn and Stroudbeck. And they posed 5 universal questions. They call them problems. I think they're just questions that will help you analyze any culture and understand what are the essence of the values in that culture. So let's take a look at those now. And the first question is, what is a human's relation to nature? What is a human's relation to nature? This has to do with beliefs about the cosmos, what's up there in the sky, are there aliens? It has to do with beliefs about God, has to do with beliefs about nature and about humanity itself. So here in the U.S., we're a strongly religious country. 87% of people believe in God in the United States. So we are a very religious country. But we do have constitutional law that separates church and state. So we don't rely on religion for everything. Mostly people rely on religion for spirituality, considerations about life and death. They don't rely on religion for education. They don't rely on religion for the military. They don't rely on religion for other things so much as they rely on it for spirituality. And here in the U.S., the predominant religion is Christianity. It's not Buddhism. It's not Taoism. It's not Islam, although you find plenty of people practicing those. It's not agnostics. It's not atheists. It's Christians. And the Protestant denomination is the most common denomination of religion here in the U.S. When it comes to looking at life, we do in the U.S. tend to value human life more than animals, unless you're a vegetarian or a vegan. And so here in the U.S., we have no problem with going to the store and buying hamburger meat or buying steak or buying anything that comes from livestock, because it's more important that humans live and prosper than it is for the animals to prosper. Also, there is the belief that scientific method here in the U.S., scientific method is quite adept at solving problems. I was listening to a news report yesterday that's talking about the opioid addiction that's going on in the U.S., and there were some commentators on CNN talking about how the FDA, Federal Drug Administration, is considering prescribing an opioid-based remedy to overcome opioid addiction. I mean, people who are heroin addicts, for example, they are sometimes treated with methadone, which is another drug which is equally addicting. That's because science says that this is effective. So these drugs have gone through testing. We believe in science for solving problems. We also have a strong belief in the U.S. We're still talking about humans' relation to nature, by the way. We have a strong belief that science and technology are good things. We fill our lives with gadgets. I mean, you're on your cell phone all day long, probably, and maybe watching television. And you have a car that may have smart technology inside of it. We like to have gadgets, including media. So we believe in science and the promise of technology. And then finally, we believe in materialism. Materialism in the U.S. is the value in owning things. We like to have things. We like to display things that we own. We like to display new clothes that we buy. We like to display our car. We like to display whatever it is that you own. We like others to see that and recognize that. But it also means that we're constantly buying things, and it means that we're constantly throwing things away because they're no longer of value. I'm having a hell of a time getting rid of an old television. It's perfectly good in my house because it does not meet the new standards of the length and width. And so I can't get anybody to buy it, even for $5 on Craigslist, even though it's a perfectly good television. Now let's move on to the second question, which is, what is the modality of human activity? What is the modality of human activity? What do we do with our time? It has to do with work, play, and self-improvement. Ask yourself, what's the balance of those 3 things in your life? Work, play, and self-improvement. I bet the biggest chunk is work, right? We're a very work-oriented culture, and work is part of our identity. We've already talked about that in a previous class. Going along with our human activity is the value of time. We place a lot of value on time. We'll talk about that in the next item as well. But for this item, human activity, we have a view of time as helping us achieve efficiency. So we like to be efficient. We don't like to hang around talking about things just for the sake of talking about things. If we're going to talk about something, we want to make sure that it's in helping us to achieve something, like finding out information that will help us register for a class, finding out information that will help us find out what's going on in town that we want to try and spend our time doing. Time is very efficient in the U.S. Also, with our activity, we believe in practicality. We are a practical people here in the U.S. If you look at the average suburban house, it's a rectangular shape. A lot of times it's without a lot of ornamentation. You go to Paris or France, you'll find lots of differences. You'll find gardens in houses. You'll find lots of ornamentation around the roof line, porches, etc. You find that more so in other countries. Not that we don't have that here in the U.S. My own house has ornamentation. We do have gardens, but generally speaking, we are a practical people. And that also means that we are unwilling to make short-term sacrifices for long-term gains. We want things now. We want to get things done now because there may not be a tomorrow. And then finally, our human activity is based on the idea that progress is good, or change. Change is progress, not necessarily bad. It's good. Things are changing at ESU. There's a new dorm going up. People will see that as a good thing, or residence hall, I should say. That's a good thing. It's not that it's taking away some more open space. It's not that it's contributing more chemicals to the environment. It's a good thing. So we see change as good. Now let's move to the third question, or problem, as I said that the researchers posed. What is the temporal focus of humans? Temporal means time. And first of all, we view time as a commodity. That is something that you buy and sell, and it has value. It has monetary value to it. So we actually have sayings in our culture like time is money, or make sure you budget your time. We treat it as an expense, time is. And that results in us constantly being aware of time. People who don't know what time it is in our culture tend to feel uncomfortable. They want to know when we're supposed to eat at 5 o'clock. What time is it? Seems like it's late, okay? Not necessarily going by whether their stomach is hungry, but by going by knowing what the time is. We'd like to know the time. Also, we are aware of the past, the present, and the future. In other cultures, those three things are blended together. We're aware of what happened yesterday is gone. We even have sayings like, can't bring back the past, can't change the past. We have sayings like, I'm ready to move on. That's looking towards the future. That's an indication of our culture being very, very aware of the past, present, and future. Now let's go to the fourth question. The fourth question is, what is the character of our innate human nature? Our innate is something that is inborn. It's absolutely essential to who you are as a being. So our innate human nature is based in somewhat on the Puritan belief. We mentioned the Puritans earlier. It has to do with the questions like evil. Are human beings naturally good? Are they naturally bad? Are they naturally evil? Etc. The Puritans generally believe that human beings are evil, but they have the potential to be good. I mean, the whole concept of sin, for example, which is not unique to the Puritans, to me that's a very foreign concept. It's the idea that you have badness in you that you need to confess. That's speaking to this. It's speaking to that human beings in the United States have an innate nature where some of us, based on that particular religion, believe that human beings have a dimension of evil that need to be controlled. And yet in our country, because of the scientific method, we also believe that humans can act on the basis of reason, that we can reason our way out of things. We're trying to figure out right now, for example, did the Russians interfere in the U.S. election? We're not making a snap judgment necessarily. We're not talking to the Russians. We might, but we're going through congressional hearings right now. We have a special investigator, Mueller, who's been named, and we have various people asking questions and debating. That's a reasoned discourse. It's not necessarily emotional, although we have emotions at play there. We're trying to figure it out. Also under this item is the idea that humans are mutable. That means changeable. Humans are mutable. They can be changed by society. We believe that humans can be changed, but it takes larger societal structures to do that. We believe that prison, for example, can rehabilitate people. I have a friend's wife who I don't know how to describe this, but horrendously killed a motorcyclist by drunken driving. and she has served 3.5 years of a 3 to 7 year sentence in a federal prison in Pennsylvania, actually Cambridge Springs, and she's going to be released. And that is because of the belief that prison has taught her her lesson, it's punished her, and she's going to be able to be a valuable member of society. Similarly, we perceive of the military for some people as giving a person discipline where discipline was lacking. Not all people who join the military, but some. Similarly, we believe that education can improve your prospects for employment. That's presumably why you're getting a Bachelor of Arts degree. Here in the communication department and other liberal arts disciplines, we would wish that there was more of a belief that it's important in and of itself to gain knowledge. But most people go to college because their primary focus is to have a better paying job or to get a job to begin with. So those are examples of how our innate human nature is characterized here in the U.S. And finally, we go to the question, what is the relationship of the individual to others? So first of all, we've already defined how we're a very individualistic culture. We know about that. But we know that we also define ourselves in terms of our occupation. Are you a professor? Are you a real estate agent? Are you a customer service representative? Are you a plumber? Are you a highway engineer? We tend to see ourselves based on our job. We have a relationship to others through our workplace occupation. Constantly, the two words that come up when people are asked to describe what makes Americans Americans, two words come up. One is independence, and the other is individuality. That you're your own person. You're responsible for your own destiny in life. And feeding into that is our First Amendment, because our First Amendment gives us free speech and free expression rights. So that gives us the power and also the legal right to be able to express what we believe by ourselves, not necessarily believing what our family tells us to believe or our friends tell us to believe or our religion tells us to believe. We have the right to choose our own path. And we can see this in the way that we name our children here in the U.S. We name our children not based on family names, as some of you may be named after family members, and you may have Junior attached to your name. But that's very, very common in other cultures, more traditional cultures. Whereas in the U.S., we have people who are named after products. We have people who, I have a lot of students now who have my last name as their first name, Mackenzie. That's something that wouldn't have happened in a traditional society. It's only a last name from Scotland. But we have names given to our children that are individual. Also, competition is celebrated. It's not put down in this culture, it's celebrated. In your classes, you're competing against other people. When you're going for a job, you're competing against other candidates. When you and your friends are having a discussion, you're competing about who knows more about a certain subject. Competition is seen as healthy in here, and that's because it's speaking to the relationship between the individual and others. Also, self-motivation is important in our culture. That we have this whole idea you have to set goals for yourself. If you take the FYE course here at ESU, first year experience, I'm sure that goals were discussed. That's getting to the idea that only you can motivate yourself, that self-motivation comes from within. And let's not forget about the Protestant ethic, right? We said that Protestant is the most dominant religion of the Christian religions in the U.S. The Protestant ethic is synonymous with hard work. It's the idea that hard work is something that can help you personally achieve what you want to achieve. You don't need to rely on others. You can achieve what you want to achieve just through working very, very hard. And then there's the matter of industrialization. Industrialization, one of the most defining moments in the history of the U.S., where we went from making things on the farm and making things by hand to factories pumping out goods that look the same. This paperclip here, it's not original. It wasn't made by one person. There are hundreds of thousands of them, if not millions out there. That's through industrialization. But what industrialization did is it gave people the opportunity to pursue the occupation of their choice because many more jobs were opened up. So just because your dad was a carpenter doesn't mean that you have to become a carpenter. Just because your mom was a housewife doesn't mean that you have to become a housewife. You can become a lawyer, you can become a doctor, you can become a professor, you can become a event planner. These are things that you get to choose, primarily because industrialization opened up all these jobs. Also in this country, in terms of our relationship to others, we have a skepticism of government. We know that because of the Boston Tea Party, right? We believe that government should basically stay the hell out of the way. That's what most people think about the government. And when government gets involved, they're going to screw things up. That's not the case in other cultures. A lot of people have a very favorable opinion of government. And then there's the whole idea that equality is important in our culture, and that speaks to the individual's relationship to others as well, because everybody is said to be treated equally. The civil rights movement did that, and in making it illegal for black people to have to sit at the back of the bus or use separate water fountains. We have gay rights. We have a lot of debates constantly going on about whether transgendered people and gay people and lesbian and bisexual and transgendered, whether they can use bathrooms interchangeably. That's speaking to whether people should be treated equally. And we have lots of other laws that get at this equality, to try and make sure that nobody is discriminated against, everybody is treated equally in this country. So for all of its worth, we arrive at our last comment, which is kind of tough to figure out, and that is, why is there so much conformity in our culture? I once had a friend say to me, America's the place where you can choose to be like everybody else. And I think that's kind of a telling thing, because even though we have all this theoretical choice, in actual fact, we choose to have a certain look to us, a certain belief system that's like other people. That's why we have the whole idea of fads, like jogger pants. You know, if you don't have a pair of jogger pants, you may feel left out. You may not, but a lot of people do, because they want to be part of what the latest fad is. It's about conforming, being like other people. So we have brands. You know, people will not want to wear clothes that don't have some kind of identifier, Aeropostale or whatever, that says, "Hey, this is my style. I'm glumming on to whatever this style of Aeropostale is getting across in its commercials. That's what I'm taking on too." Also, conformity shows up in the sayings that we have in our culture. We have sayings like, somebody will just say off the top of their head, "Been there, done that." You know, instead of inventing their own saying, they'll say what a cliche is that's out there that other people have used to describe a similar feeling, because we want to describe it similarly. This massacre that went on in Manchester a couple days ago, what's the most common things that people are saying when they're commenting on it? They're saying, "Our prayers and thoughts go out," or "Our thoughts and prayers go out." It's even reversed, right? So people don't even say prayers and thoughts to shake it up. They say thoughts and prayers, as opposed to inventing your own original way of saying it. We have a lot of sayings that we copy. And then finally, just think about this example. There's not a single member of the U.S. Senate that has long hair who is a male. Now think about that. You've got friends who are men with long hair, right? So why don't we have one? Because when you get to the Senate, you conform to what other people look like. So there you have it. Some descriptions of the United States, which make us both a national culture in terms of what we think of as our values are as a people, and also how we are represented to other people around the world. And that's going to wrap up today's instructor video lecture. I hope you have a great and dry day.